Alright, we are back, of course, talking some FF7. More interviews, more Hamaguchi, more talk of Part 3, more talk of the end of Part 3, more discussions of are things going to be different. A decent amount of interviews out there, like Screen Rant, Polygon, Brazil IGN, and maybe some others, so we're just going to hop into it. And naturally, of course, a lot of this comes to us courtesy of the boys over at Shinra Archaeology Department. Hamaguchi says they paid a lot of attention in the cases where they changed the OG's story. The approach they've taken, basically, is that you have the OG FF7 world storyline, and then they've made this alternate storyline. And when it seems like it's about to change, these characters called Whispers try to fix it to return it to how it was. And so with that idea in place, they're very mindful of the OG Final Fantasy VII storyline, and they've sort of aimed to make it so you can't predict the conclusion, and make it unclear if the story is going to change along this new storyline. So clearly this is some shit we've talked about for literally years at this point. You know where I stand on this. People got different opinions on what they think is going on with the trilogy, right? Definitely when it came to Remake and we had the Whisperers very heavily involved in the game, it's controversial, but I actually kind of enjoyed it. I like the idea that, okay, we're straying from the path. There's these fucking spirit ghost things that are like correcting the path, right? Putting us back on track for what's happening with the original FF7. There was some aspect of that I actually liked, even though it wasn't something that was with the original FF7, right? It was very different, obviously. But the idea that we could stray from the path, I thought was intriguing. But going into Rebirth, we don't really have that shit. And that's what's a little confusing to me is when they talk about, oh, can things be different? Like when it came to Rebirth, we essentially, for the most part, did everything that we've already done in the original FF7 up to the events of Aerith's death. And even then, at least in one of the worlds, she does die, at least the main world. If it makes any sense at all when it comes to Rebirth, there's no moments where our characters are trying to do things different. Like all throughout Remake, there's all kinds of moments where like our characters try to do something different from the original game, and the Whispers get involved and make them like kind of correct course, right? There's nothing like that really that I can think of in Rebirth. It's like they, for me, backpedaled a lot on what they set up in Remake. To be clear, when it comes to Remake and Rebirth, there's obviously new shit that they're doing, right? That they're exploring with the story. And there's like the multi-world shit we're seeing in Rebirth and that they're going to continue doing in the third game, right? With like Zack and Sephiroth and things like that. There's clearly new stuff. But like 95% of what we've done between both games is just the original game expanded. So the talk of whether or not the story will conclude the same as the original game, like, for one, that's just not going to happen. It's just straight up factually not going to happen because they're going to give us an actual definitive kind of ending, right? The original game just rolls credits. Just goes to black, right? So like they're obviously going to do something different from that in a literal sense. But whether or not it's picks up where like the FF7 original game kind of ends off and goes into the compilation. Going into Dirge, going into Advent Children, all the way to Smile, whatever, right? Like that remains to be seen, but I assume that'll be the case. Hamaguchi says that with the FF7R project, they've taken the through line of the OG story and carefully combined it with all sorts of timeline storylines and created something that can keep players feeling excited and wondering how everything is going to turn out. So we definitely got to pause there for a second because the word timeline was used, which I know the sequel truthers, or the theory bros as people call them, are going to latch on to the Hamaguchi using the word timeline. And I'm not even denying that he used the word because he's used it before. Like at least once. There's one interview people latch on to a lot where he used the word timeline. I don't remember what interview it was. But also this interview quotes Hamaguchi as saying that fucking Elmira is the backbone of the entire story. Hamaguchi says FF7 has many fans, so they were very careful to make certain additions and changes without altering the OG story too much, without stripping it of its essence. Their approach to achieving that was precisely centered around the character Elmira. Obviously, this was a mistake, and Shinra does correct it in the follow-up to that particular tweet. There is actually like a video interview of this with IGN Brazil, and somehow they confused Hamaguchi talking about the Whispers for Elmira. I don't know how you make that mistake. And I don't speak Portuguese, so I don't know if Hamaguchi does actually use the word timeline. I'm sure he does. Again, I'm not denying that. But just in case he doesn't actually use the word timeline, I just want to point out that the people that are like transcribing what he says are making some pretty major mistakes. As for the use of the word timeline, it's not proof of anything either way. I've used the word timeline, even though I don't believe in the multiverse stuff or sequel stuff, right? I've used the word timeline when talking about the other worlds. So like, I don't think it's proof of anything, but if that for you is some sort of evidence to support sequel theory, you can have it. That's a basic concept, and he can tell you that approach is something that's not going to change in Part 3. Obviously on his end, he's got the ending to the trilogy all drawn out in his head. But at this point, what they're aiming for now is to deliver an ending both OG fans and new players who entered with the Remake series can find compelling, something they can fall in love with all over again, and that's something he's feeling confident they'll be able to do. So he hopes everyone excitedly looking forward to seeing if the OG story will change or not, will play Part 3 and enjoy seeing how everything unfolds. So yeah, we kind of already talked about it in the video. Like, in a very literal sense, the ending to Part 3 will be different from the ending to FF7 original. Will it be different in the sense that it is a sequel and things are drastically different and it's multiverse stuff and whatever? That remains to be seen. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I'm sure some of you do, maybe a lot of you do. I'm of the belief that it's going to lead into the compilation stuff. That's what we've been more or less directly told from both, Katase and Nomura and stuff like that, right? In terms of it connecting to Advent Children, but also the fact that they can't remake Dirge of Cerberus until the trilogy is done, so on and so forth. We talked about it a lot. Whatever. Asked about whether he prefers Cloud or Sephiroth, Naoki Hamaguchi says he can't weigh in on which characters he likes more because fans will hear it and start to think there's favoritism, so he says he likes all the characters. This one's a bit strange because there are people in their replies kind of bitching that Hamaguchi won't give an actual answer here, and I kind of get that from a dev perspective, kind of playing the fence, right? You don't want to you want to be kind of impartial, you like all the characters, that whole thing. However, he's actually answered this before, and I only know this because we look at all these goddamn interviews all the time for the FF7 stuff. And earlier this year, actually, in an interview with Danny Pena, Katase and Hamaguchi were both asked who their favorite characters were. Hamaguchi said Cloud. Here's a bit from the Gamer article covering this. Hamaguchi started off by noting that his choice is a bit cliche since his favorite of the bunch is Cloud. He explained that it's because he's been working on the remake trilogy for nearly a decade at this point. He's always had Cloud there in front of him during development. Because of this, Cloud has become like family to Hamaguchi, which is actually rather sweet. So it is kind of weird. I don't know why earlier this year he was down to answer this question who his favorite character was, and then with this particular interview he doesn't want to give an answer. Kind of weird, but I'll answer it for Hamaguchi. His favorite character is Cloud. Also, I guess last year during the Reddit AMA, Hamaguchi also said that his favorite character was Cloud. So again, kind of weird. Hamaguchi says when it came to making that choice with the team where they have to directly modify the storyline of the OG, they have a lot of people who really respect the OG story, and you get a lot of emotions coming out in those cases. The approach they ended up taking was next to the OG storyline, they've prepared this separate timeline layer, this parallel layer, where when the story seems like it's about to change, you have the Whispers coming in to sort of try to correct the flow and return things to normal. And so you have this question of whether things will proceed the same as they did in the OG story, or whether we're in for a different conclusion. That's something even players who know the OG story can be excited about. It's basically the approach they decided on. So I've said my piece a lot on what I think's happening with the remake stuff, right? And I still stand by that. But I do want to say, going back to the discussion of multiverse, timelines, sequel theory, things like that, we talked about in the past about how potentially the original FF7 has its own timeline, right? And maybe the remake shit is separate of that, right? So there's the original game's timeline, then there's remake's timeline, and there's Beagle World and all those other dogs and stuff like that, right? Whatever. More than one of the interviews we looked at today, Hamaguchi has said something along those lines of how OG FF7 has its own storyline, right? And then there's the remake stuff. Also proposed the theory in the past that our party's world, Beagle World, which we kind of call the main world, right? The main timeline, if you want to call it that, is potentially another world inside the planet. And where I came to that conclusion was that what differentiates the worlds inside the planet is the different stamp logos. And obviously our party's world has a stamp logo. But if you go back to the original FF7, there isn't one. Obviously the original game on PS1 almost 30 years ago, not having a fucking Beagle logo, stamp logo, whatever, probably doesn't matter in the context of the remake trilogy, which is a reimagining of the original FF7, right? But it was something we just kind of talked about back in the day. About, at least with just remake, there was remake timeline with Beagle World, and there's Terror World with Zack, and then potentially the original FF7 also had its own world. Now we know with Rebirth there's potentially infinite worlds inside the planet, so whatever. I just thought I'd mention it because I can't recall a time in the past with any sort of interviews where they've talked about, any of the devs, talking about FF7 original having its own timeline, parallel layer, whatever, and then remakes its own, this separate thing from the OG or whatever. I don't think they've ever talked about that before. So I thought it was kind of interesting. Naoki Hamaguchi says the goal of the project is to take the original storyline, add new things from spin-offs and other sources that already existed in the world of FF7, split it into 3 games, and by doing so, make fans wonder how the story will end. So obviously this kind of comes back to what we talk about a lot on the channel these days, and what they're doing with the story is just taking the original game story, expanding the lore. Things from other sources like spin-offs and sequels and things like that, right? The problem about when we talk about this shit is every time you talk about how they're expanding the lore, adding stuff from the compilation, people are like, well, when I played the original FF7, I certainly don't remember the Whispers. When I played the original FF7, I don't remember there being multiple worlds inside the planet. And it's yeah, that's where the expanding of the lore comes from. The planet itself this time around is a character, more so than it was sort of in the original FF7, right? And they're also expanding the lore and how the livestream itself works. It's also how we get things from the future that we're seeing in the remake story, right? This retelling of FF7. People talk about, okay, this is a sequel because we fight the fucking remnants from Advent Children at the end of Remake, right? And it's not really. I mean, they are supposed to be them, but the twisted manifestations of them. We didn't actually fight the actual Kadaz, Laws, and Yazoo, right? If we did, that'd be a little more interesting. But if you go back to what Red 13 says in Remake when he's talking about destiny, it's the great flow of the planet from inception to oblivion.
Like capital D? Destiny?
The flow of the great river that is the planet, from inception to oblivion.
So the planet slash the live stream, they're kind of one and the same, really. Knows everything that has ever happened and ever will happen, at least according to Red 13 and Remake, right? That's what I mean when I talk about them expanding the lore and how the live stream works when it comes to the Remake games. And that's potentially also how Sephiroth got the knowledge that he has, right? Whenever Cloud killed him in the Nibelheim incident, him falling into the planet potentially gathered all that knowledge, past, present, future. And what we're seeing here in this reimagining of the FF7 story is Sephiroth trying to change that future. It doesn't have to be 100% a sequel just because characters have knowledge of the future, right? With 2 games in the trilogy released so far, some fans who played the original aren't happy with the changes. Rebirth director Naoki Hamaguchi says the team is aware of the naysayers, but still excited to see how people will react to the third game. So they are very much aware of people that don't like the changes they've done to aspects of the original FF7 story. And we also read earlier, some of the devs, people making the game, weren't happy with some of the changes they were doing to the original story, right? So it's part of why I don't think that they're going to go that crazy. Like, people that are like, this is a sequel, it's drastically different, these characters are alive instead of dead this time. It's like, I don't think they're going to go that route, outside of, like, they're alive in different worlds, that whole thing that we've talked about so many goddamn times at this point. But yeah, there definitely is a lot of anticipation for the third game, man, just to see where and how this actually concludes, right? Based on all these different theories over the last, like, couple of years at this point, several years at this point, like, what's actually going to happen with the story in the third game. Hamaguchi says in Part 3, we already start off seeing all the team members together. What they had in mind in terms of storytelling and gameplay is that players would be able to develop a deeper sense of affection for each of these characters, not just Cloud. I want to read this for a few reasons. For one, he says that we start Part 3 with all the team members together, right? Which is not true because there's not going to be an Aerith. We'll definitely have a nice full party to begin the game of 8 characters, not 9. Outside of Cloud probably seeing Aerith like throughout the story potentially, manifestations of her. Obviously she's not actually there. Whether or not it's the real Aerith is a bit of a different conversation. We kind of talked about that theory. It could be like, Genova manipulation potentially. But like, she'll be throughout the story obviously, but she won't be a playable character outside of maybe particular fights in the game or something, like at the end of the game. Essentially what they did with Zack in Rebirth, they'll probably be doing with Aerith, right? Where she's in the planet in these other worlds doing shit, which would be kind of nice because with the original game, it's obviously she dies and it is emotional and it's effective and stuff like that, but that's like all of Aerith until the end of the game, right? So I like that with the third game, we're definitely going to get more of her and what she's doing, and hopefully she's doing that shit with Zack. That'd be awesome if like those two are together in these other worlds inside the planet, like helping us defeat, Sephiroth from within the planet. But my dudes, I think that's where we're going to wrap up today's video. There is some more interviews out there that like Shinra covered, like Twisted Voxel and stuff like that, but there wasn't necessarily anything from that I thought was worth talking about. There's definitely some other bits from these interviews that maybe we didn't feel like talking about in this video, but also potentially that, Shinra themselves didn't want to cover. Of course, we'll try to link to everything in the description below. Anyways, that is the video, my dudes. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @ffvii. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain or leave it like Cobain.